There is a ghost that haunts the modern NHRA. It doesn't rattle chains, it rattles the very foundations of how we define fair play. In the early 1970s, the drag racing world was a brotherhood of grease, loud noises, and might makes right. If you had the biggest engine, you won. It was simple. It was predictable. And then came the man they called Grumpy. Bill Jenkins didn't look like a hero. He didn't look like an athlete. He looked like a frustrated math teacher who had spent too many hours in a basement. He was thin, he always had a cheap cigar burning a hole in the air, and he looked like he hated everyone who dared to speak to him. But inside that skull was a biological supercomputer. While other drivers were polishing their chrome, Bill Jenkins was studying the atomic weight of aluminum. While they were bragging about their horsepower, Bill was calculating the exact millisecond of traction loss ratio. The curiosity begins here. How did a man with a fraction of the budget of the big factory teams, Ford, Chrysler, and even his own brand, Chevy, manage to make them look like they were standing still? The rumors started in the pits. He's got a hidden tank. He's using airplane fuel. He's got a secret button. People were obsessed. They were desperate to prove he was a fraud because the alternative was too terrifying to face, that Bill Jenkins was simply smarter than the entire industry combined. This isn't just a story about a fast car. This is a story about a war between the establishment and a mad scientist. The NHRA wanted a show. Bill Jenkins wanted a massacre. He didn't just want to win by an inch. He wanted to win so decisively that the rulebook would have to be set on fire and thrown away. And as we peel back the layers of his 1972 Vega, you'll realize that the cheating everyone talked about was actually something far more brilliant and far more legal than anyone dared to imagine. The Vega conspiracy, physics as a weapon. The year 1972 wasn't just another racing season, it was the year Bill Jenkins declared war on the status quo. To understand why this section of history is so controversial, you have to understand what a pro-stock car was supposed to be back then. In the early 70s, pro-stock was literally professional stock. The cars were supposed to be heavy, factory-based steel monsters. The philosophy was simple: shove the biggest engine you can find into a street car, put some fat tires on the back, and pray that the chassis doesn't twist into a pretzel when you drop the clutch. Chrysler was the king of this era. Their Hemi engines were legendary, pushing out massive amounts of torque. They were the bullies of the drag strip. Then, Bill Jenkins rolled out of his shop in Malvern, Pennsylvania, with Grumpy's Toy 9, a 1972 Chevy Vega. The crowd at the Winter Nationals laughed. The Vega was a subcompact car. It was Chevy's answer to fuel economy, not a performance machine. It was small, it was narrow, and compared to the massive Plymouth Cudas and Dodge Challengers, it looked like a toy. But Bill Jenkins didn't see a commuter car. He saw a loophole. He realized that the NHRA rulebook calculated classes based on a weight-to-cubic-inch ratio. Everyone else was going big engines, big cars. Bill went small. He realized that a small block V8 in a lightweight, aerodynamic body would be harder to catch than a freight train with a jet engine. The illegal chassis that wasn't illegal. This is where the cheating accusations began. When Bill unveiled the Vega, the NHRA tech inspectors nearly had a heart attack. Underneath the thin Vega skin was a full tube chassis framework. At the time, drag cars were expected to use the original factory frame rails. But Bill had read the rules over and over. He found that the rules were incredibly vague about frame reinforcement. So, instead of reinforcing a heavy stock frame, he built a lightweight, ultra-rigid skeleton of chromoly tubing and simply attached the Vega body to it. It was a masterstroke of engineering. By using a tube chassis, Bill could control the torsional rigidity of the car. While the Hemi cars were twisting and losing energy as their frames flexed under power, Bill's Vega stayed laser straight. Every ounce of energy from the engine went directly into the pavement. The competitors screamed that it was a funny car, a different, more radical class, disguised as a pro stock. But Bill just pulled out his copy of the rulebook, highlighted the vague language, and stared them down. He hadn't broken a rule. He had simply invented a new way to build a car that the rules hadn't forbidden yet. The McPherson strut scandal. If the chassis was the skeleton, the suspension was the soul of the Vega's cheating myth. Bill introduced McPherson's strut front suspension to the world of drag racing. In 1972, this was unheard of. Drag cars used heavy, A-arm suspensions. Bill's struts were light, compact, and allowed for an incredible amount of front-end travel. Why does this matter? It's all about instant center and weight transfer. When a drag car starts, you want the front end to rise so the weight slams onto the rear tires for maximum grip. Bill's McPherson struts were so light and so perfectly tuned that his Vega had the most violent, efficient weight transfer in history. While his rivals were spinning their tires, trying to get their heavy front ends to move, Bill's Vega was already 10 feet ahead, its nose in the air, biting the track like a predator. The NHRA officials spent weeks trying to find a reason to ban the struts. They measured the mounting points, they checked the angles, and they analyzed the materials. They were desperate to find a cheat. But Bill had engineered the struts to fit within the spirit of the geometry rules while completely obliterating the intent of the rules. He had weaponized the McPherson strut, turning a humble suspension design into a tool of total domination. Then there was the engine. While Chrysler was running 426 Hemis, Bill was running a 331 cubic inch small block Chevy. The math didn't seem to add up. How could a smaller engine beat a bigger one? The curiosity in the pits was borderline insane. People were convinced Bill was hiding something hot in the fuel or using a secret cheater intake. In reality, Bill had mastered volumetric efficiency. He understood that a smaller engine that could rev higher and breathe better was more efficient than a giant engine that was struggling to move its own heavy internal parts. He spent thousands of hours on the flow bench, porting cylinder heads until they were works of art. He wasn't using magic parts, he was using perfect parts. When the Vega made its debut at the 1972 Winter Nationals, it didn't just win, it humiliated the field. It was so much faster than anything else that the NHRA was forced to do a teardown of the engine right there in front of everyone. They took the head off, they measured the bores, they checked the crank. They found absolutely nothing illegal. Bill Jenkins had out-engineered the entire American auto industry with a small block Chevy and a commuter car. This was the moment the cheater label was permanently stuck to him. Not because he broke the rules, but because his genius made everyone else look incompetent. He had found the white space in the law, the area where the rules are silent, and he lived there. But as the Vega started stacking up trophies, the NHRA realized they had a problem. Their star teams were being destroyed by a man who refused to follow the unwritten rules of the sport. They couldn't find a mechanical cheat, so they decided to do something much more drastic. They decided to change the physics of the game specifically to stop Bill Jenkins. But as we're about to see, the Grump had one more trick up his sleeve that would leave the officials speechless. In the high-octane world of professional drag racing, victory isn't just decided by the mechanical limits of a machine, it is decided in the mental headspace of the men operating them. Bill Jenkins was a master of a discipline that wasn't listed in any engineering textbook, psychological dominance. While his rivals were obsessed with the what of his car, Bill was playing with the who of the competition. He understood that a distracted, intimidated, or paranoid opponent is an opponent that has already lost. If you look at the archival footage from the early 1970s, you won't see Bill Jenkins shaking hands, smiling for the cameras, or engaging in the typical PR-friendly banter of a sports hero. Instead, you see a man who looks perpetually bothered. The trademark cigar was always clamped between his teeth, the eyebrows were perpetually furrowed into a scowl, and his interactions with the world were clipped, cold, and often hostile. This was the grumpy persona. But was it just a personality flaw? Or was it the most sophisticated, illegal modification ever installed in a race car? Bill Jenkins realized very early in his career that information was the most valuable currency at the drag strip. In an era before locked garages and high-security transporters, the pits were a vulnerable place. Rival mechanics would walk by, trying to catch a glimpse of a manifold or a suspension mounting point. Tech inspectors would linger, asking probing questions about engine displacement or fuel mixtures. To counter this, Bill built a wall of hostility. By being intentionally difficult, unapproachable, and grumpy, he created a physical and emotional buffer zone around his equipment. When you are terrified of a man, you don't linger near his car. You don't ask for a closer look at his carburetors. His personality served as a high-tech security system. He didn't have to hide his secrets behind a curtain because his very presence acted as a deterrent. He weaponized his reputation to ensure that when people looked at his car, they saw exactly what he wanted them to see and nothing more. The most critical moment for any innovative racer is the tech inspection. This is where NHRA officials have the power to disqualify a car based on their interpretation of the rules. Inspectors are human beings, susceptible to fatigue, irritation, and intimidation. Bill Jenkins knew this, and he used it to his advantage with surgical precision. When the inspectors arrived at Bill's pit, he didn't greet them with coffee and a smile. He greeted them with a look that suggested they were incompetent children wasting his time. He would snap at them for moving too slowly or criticize the way they held a micrometer. This created a high-stress environment for the officials. Subconsciously, an inspector under that kind of verbal fire wants the interaction to end as quickly as possible. Because of the grumpy pressure, inspectors would often perform a checklist inspection rather than a discovery inspection. They would check the bores, the stroke, and the safety equipment, the standard items, and then they would clear the car just to escape the cloud of cigar smoke and the biting remarks. By controlling the emotional tempo of the inspection, Bill ensured that the truly revolutionary, gray area engineering he had hidden in plain sight was never scrutinized long enough to be understood. Bill was a master of misdirection. He understood the law of the bright, shiny object. Often, he would leave a component on the car that looked bizarre, unfinished, or slightly wrong. It might be a strange-looking bracket on the intake manifold or a series of dummy wires leading to nowhere. Rival racers and inspectors would spend hours obsessing over these decoys. They would argue about what the grump was doing with that specific part, convinced they had found his secret. While they were focused on the shiny object, they were ignoring the fact that Bill had completely redesigned the internal oiling system to gain 3 horsepower, or that he had found a way to cheat the air-fuel ratio through a subtle modification in the plenum that was invisible to the naked eye. Bill didn't just hide his secrets, he gave people fake secrets to find. The psychological warfare extended all the way to the staging lanes. When you lined up against Bill Jenkins, you weren't just racing a Chevy Vega, you were racing a myth. The rumors that he was cheating, or had magic engines, were fueled by his silence and his secrecy. This created a fear factor that was worth 1/10 of a second on the track. His rivals would overthink their own setups. They would try to rev their engines higher to keep up with the grumpy magic, leading to mechanical failures. They would red light at the start because they were so desperate to get a jump on the man they believed was invincible. Bill would sit in the other lane, cold and calculated, as steady as a machine. He had defeated the driver's mind long before the tires ever touched the asphalt. To Bill, emotions were just another variable to be managed, like air pressure or ignition timing. He viewed the grumpy persona as a tool, no different from a torque wrench. It was a means to an end. He stripped the sport of its romanticism and turned it into a cold, hard, mathematical contest. He proved that in a world of grease monkeys, an engineer with a psychological edge is a god. He didn't care about being liked, he cared about being the fastest. And by making himself the most hated man in the pits, he became the most successful man on the track. He proved that the greatest engine in the world is the one between the ears, and if you can tune that engine correctly, you can make the rest of the world play your game. Section 4. The Weight Penalty War, Bending the Will of the NHRA. By 1973, the NHRA, National Hot Rod Association, was facing an existential crisis. They had a grumpy problem that was threatening the commercial viability of the sport. Drag racing at its core is a spectacle. It relies on the diversity of brands, the tribal warfare between Ford, Mopar, and Chevy fans. But Bill Jenkins had turned pro stock into a one-man show. His 1972 Vega hadn't just beaten the competition, it had demoralized them. The massive factory teams from Chrysler with their multi-million-dollar budgets and legendary Hemi engines were being embarrassed weekend after weekend by a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The fans of rival brands were growing restless, and more importantly, the corporate sponsors were furious. They were pouring money into big block development, only to be outrun by Jenkins' small block wizardry. The NHRA realized they couldn't catch Bill in a lie, because he wasn't lying. He wasn't breaking the rules. He was simply better at reading them. So, the NHRA did the only thing a governing body can do when they are being outsmarted. They changed the laws of physics. The NHRA introduced a new, complex handicap system known as the weight per cubic inch rules. On the surface, it was marketed as a way to balance the field. In reality, it was a tactical strike aimed directly at Bill Jenkins. The officials calculated exactly where Bill's advantage lay, his power-to-weight ratio, and they decided to bury him under a mountain of lead. They began assigning weight penalties to specific engine and chassis combinations. Because Bill's Vega was small and light, the NHRA forced him to add massive amounts of ballast. We aren't talking about a few pounds, we are talking about hundreds of pounds of dead weight. The goal was to make the Vega so heavy that its small block engine would physically choke under the strain. They wanted to force Bill to give up his compact philosophy and return to the heavy, gas-guzzling big block era where the factory teams held the advantage. The counterattack, engineering the ballast. Most racers would have seen this as a death sentence. To the average mechanic, weight is an enemy. It slows you down. It ruins your 60-foot time. But Bill Jenkins didn't see weight as an enemy. He saw it as ballast. While his competitors celebrated, thinking the grump was finally neutralized, Bill went back to his shop and did something brilliant. He realized that the NHRA rulebook said he had to carry the weight, but it was surprisingly vague about where that weight had to be placed. This was the opening Bill needed. Instead of just bolting lead plates to the floor of the car like a novice, Bill engineered a sophisticated weight distribution system. He treated the penalty as a tuning tool. He realized that by placing the penalty weight in precise, strategic locations, often at the very rear of the car or in specific quadrants of the chassis, he could actually improve the car's launch characteristics. He used the extra weight to slam the rear tires into the track even harder. He turned the NHRA's handicap into a traction-enhancing device. When he showed up to the track, his car was heavier, yes, but it was also more stable and more consistent than ever before. The cat-and-mouse game of 1974. The 1974 season became a legendary game of cat and mouse. Every time Bill won a race, the NHRA would hold an emergency meeting on Monday morning to add more weight to his car for the next weekend. It was a blatant attempt to slow one man down. At one point, the penalties became so absurd that the Vega was carrying a literal statue's worth of lead. But Bill was always one step ahead. He began experimenting with destabilizing the tech inspectors. He would show up with multiple engine combinations, some designed specifically to be legal but underperformers, while his real race engine was hidden until the final moments. He played a shell game with the displacement of his engines. Because he was a master of boring and stroking engines, he could change the cubic inch displacement of his V8 overnight, forcing the NHRA to recalculate his weight penalty on the fly. He made the officials work as hard as the racers. The breaking point of the institution. This era proved that Bill Jenkins was more than just a mechanic. He was a strategic genius. He proved that an institution can never move as fast as a brilliant individual. The NHRA was trying to solve a problem with bureaucracy, while Bill was solving it with calculus. The weight penalty war eventually reached a breaking point. The NHRA realized that no matter how much weight they added, Bill would find a way to make it work. His resilience forced the NHRA to completely rethink the pro stock category, eventually leading to the standardized rules we see today. They realized that you couldn't regulate genius away. Bill Jenkins had effectively broken the sport's ability to be fair, because his definition of fair was simply knowing more than you. But this war took a toll. The grumpy persona grew even darker as the battles with officials became more personal. Bill was no longer just racing against Ford or Chrysler. He was racing against the very organization that sanctioned the sport. And just when the NHRA thought they had finally cornered him, Bill Jenkins did something that no one saw coming. He didn't just win another trophy, he changed the very DNA of how a race car is built, leaving a legacy that still dominates the asphalt today. The story of Bill Jenkins doesn't end at the finish line of a 1970s drag strip. It doesn't end with the trophies or the records he shattered. The true scale of his impact can only be measured by looking at a modern pro stock car today. If you strip away the carbon fiber, the digital sensors, and the million-dollar sponsorship decals, what you find underneath is the DNA of a man who refused to accept good enough. Every high-performance drag car in the world is a direct descendant of the grumpy philosophy. Bill Jenkins didn't just win races, he revolutionized the architecture of speed. Before Bill, drag racing was a hobbyist sport. It was about who had the biggest wallet and the loudest exhaust. Bill Jenkins transformed it into a rigorous, data-driven science. He was the first to treat the drag strip like a laboratory and the race car like a scientific instrument. This is the legacy of the untouchable. When Bill Jenkins introduced the tube chassis 1972 Vega, he wasn't just building a car, he was writing a blueprint that the entire industry would follow for the next 50 years. The concept of the funny car-style chassis in a pro-stock body was controversial at the time, but today, it is the universal standard. Bill understood that the car's body is merely a shell. The real work happens in the geometry of the skeleton. His obsession with weight transfer and center of gravity forced every other engineer to go back to the drawing board. He proved that traction isn't just about having sticky tires, it's about the mechanical leverage of the chassis against the earth. When you see a modern drag car launch with its front wheels inches off the ground, perfectly balanced, you are seeing Bill Jenkins' ghost at work. He took the magic out of the launch and replaced it with a mathematical formula that guaranteed a win. For decades, The big block engine was the undisputed king of American muscle. Bill Jenkins was the small block prophet who showed the world that efficiency beats brute force every single time. By perfecting the small block Chevy V8, he influenced an entire generation of engine builders. His work on cylinder head airflow, intake manifold harmonics, and valve train stability set the stage for the engines we see in everything from NASCAR to modern street performance. He proved that volumetric efficiency, the ability of an engine to breathe, was more important than raw cubic inches. This shift in thinking changed the automotive industry. Manufacturers began to realize that they could get more power out of smaller, lighter packages. In many ways, the high-performance engines we drive today owe their existence to the cold, hard calculations Bill performed on his workbench in Pennsylvania. To this day, the cheating rumors persist. In every corner of the internet where car enthusiasts gather, people still argue about what Bill really did. He must have had a hidden nitrous system, some say. He was running a secret fuel additive, others claim. But the beauty of the Jenkins legacy is that the cheat was never a part. It was his mind. The greatest trick Bill Jenkins ever pulled was convincing the world that his advantage was a secret mechanical device, when in reality, his advantage was simply that he worked harder and thought deeper than anyone else. He was a man who lived in the gray area. He understood that the rulebook is not a wall, it's a set of suggestions. He didn't break the rules, he simply mastered them to a degree that appeared supernatural to the uneducated observer. That is the definition of an untouchable legacy, when your performance is so high that the only way people can explain it is by accusing you of magic or malice. The grumpy philosopher. Bill Jenkins passed away in 2012, but his philosophy remains, "I don't cheat, I just read better than you." This statement is the ultimate takeaway for any creator, engineer, or competitor. It's a reminder that the system is only as rigid as your lack of imagination. Bill taught us that the establishment can be defeated by a single person with a cigar, a calculator, and a refusal to back down. He left the sport better than he found it. He forced the NHRA to become more professional, he forced the manufacturers to become more innovative, and he forced the fans to appreciate the beauty of a well-engineered machine. He was the mad scientist of the asphalt, a man who turned 9 seconds of chaos into a symphony of precision. So, was Bill Jenkins a cheater? He was a pioneer. He was a man who realized that the fastest way to the finish line wasn't through the throttle, it was through the library and the drafting table. He outsmarted the NHRA because he viewed their rules as a puzzle to be solved, not a cage to be trapped in. As we close the file on Grumpy Bill Jenkins, remember that in any field of life, there will always be people who try to slow you down with weight penalties. There will always be people who call your genius a cheat because they can't replicate your results. When that happens, take a page out of Bill's book. Light a cigar, look at the math, and leave them all in your rearview mirror. Bill Jenkins didn't just win the race, he owned the track. And that is why, 60 years later, we are still talking about the man who was too grumpy to lose.